Welcome to The Focused View, the podcast for eye care professionals across Australia. In each episode, we bring together leaders from optometry, optical dispensing, and business to share insights, practical strategies, and the latest developments shaping independent practice today. I'm your host, Michael Nasser, and together we'll explore how innovation, collaboration, and smart business thinking can drive growth, enhance patient care, and strengthen the future of independent optometry. Whether you're a student, an early career professional, or an established practice owner, The Focused View is your go-to source for knowledge, inspiration, and connection. The Focused View is brought to you by Vision Connection, supporting independent eye care professionals across Australia through collaboration, education, and business growth. By working closely with leading suppliers and industry partners, Vision Connection offers unique opportunities that help independents stand out and succeed. To find out more, visit their website, visionconnection.com.au. On today's episode, I'm really excited to be joined by Dr. Steve Vargo, optometrist, practice management consultant, author, and host of the Eye Owner Business podcast. Steve brings a wealth of experience and knowledge working with independent practices across the US. And today we dive deep into leadership, team management, and the people side of running a successful practice. We unpack why leadership gaps hold practices back, how to build accountability without friction, and what great leaders consistently get right when it comes to culture, communication, and growth. If you've ever felt your biggest business challenges don't sit in the exam room, this is the conversation for you. Let's get into it. Steve, welcome to the show. Really excited to have you.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
You're obviously a very seasoned expert when it comes to podcasts and sharing information with what you do in the US. But I guess for the benefit of the listeners back here in Australia and to those that listen to this podcast, can you tell us a little bit about your journey and a bit about yourself and your background and how you've ended up doing what you're doing?
Yeah, I didn't take the traditional path. We went to optometry school, and I did practice for several years in the Chicago area. And then I always had an interest on the business side of eye care, but I always thought that would come more in the realm of owning a practice, owning a business. And at some point, I was given an opportunity to do practice management consulting full time. And I took that opportunity. And for about the past 10 years, that's what I've been doing, working with other practices, primarily independent practitioners, helping them with a variety of aspects of running and operating a business.
Yeah, and a lot of the context of our conversation today will be at that top level, I guess, practice management, leadership, building a team, talking about that side of the industry as opposed to specifics with regards to clinical information or things on particular conditions. But obviously that led you to write a book and to be an author. Can you tell us a little bit about that and I guess, what you learned from that experience? And we'll obviously tease out a little bit more about that in our conversation today, but just to give us a bit of a pretext to it.
Yeah, ironically, I wrote 4 books, and the first one I didn't start out intentionally writing a book. I was actually just started writing. And I realized it's a topic I think we're going to talk about today is managing people, leadership. And I just found that a lot of the inquiries I was getting, the calls I was getting, my consulting work was taking me down that path of helping them manage their team better. And it's a difficult conversation to have in 1 hour. You leave feeling, I hope I solved their problem, but you felt like there was so much more. So I just started writing with the intention of having a document to give people after these calls. And I just kept writing and putting together stories, and it started to build on itself. And finally, one day I said, I think I've got a book here. And that became the first one. And from that, I wrote a few others, but I enjoy the process. It's a lot of work, but I enjoy the process of putting everything you've learned on a topic into a source like a book and then sharing that with others.
And for those that don't know, you have a podcast. It's called Eye Owner Business. That's the name of it. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what sort of conversations are you having in that context?
Well, it's probably going to be similar conversations that you and I are going to have today. We try to cover a lot of the areas from a business standpoint. It's a little bit of clinical, but it's mostly the business side of things. And I like to say we go beyond the exam room.
Mm.
realizing how many struggles doctors have outside of the exam room with things like managing their team, operations, HR, marketing. So we cover a wide variety of topics. We bring in experts, and I think people really get a lot out of it in terms of the insights that we're able to get. I probably like you doing this podcast, me as a host have learned a great deal. So somewhat selfishly, I really like to be in this role because I learn a lot listening to other people and asking them questions.
Yeah, I absolutely resonate with that. And I mean, a lot of those conversations do open up your eyes, or in my eyes in particular, to different ways and thought processes, and realizing how many people have been successful, and looking at those ingredients, and sharing that, because I believe that success leaves clues, and when you speak to people that have experienced that, then they share that, and I think that's to the benefit of the industry as a whole. What experiences, I guess, along that way, obviously, is quite vast in nature. It's obviously very practice management orientated business side of things, as you've mentioned. That was something that you were drawn to from the outset after you finished, optometry school. What experiences specifically made you realize that leadership as a particular point was a missing ingredient in so many practices?
I don't think I realized it until I started doing my consulting role. And the thing I started to realize was how many of the problems staff or practices were having as a result of what I like to call a leadership void. So you started to hear a lot of the same consistent problems over and over. We're not growing. We're not making progress. I'm having a lot of trouble with my staff. I can't get them on the same page. Revenues are dropping. Patients are complaining. And you start to realize who's in charge here. And you realize that there's nobody really taking the lead in terms of driving the growth. It's not going to happen passively unless you get really lucky. And then you can't plan on that being sustainable. But
Yeah.
there's nobody really driving these things. And so I took an interest in the leadership aspect, recognizing how important it was when it's not there, and how devastating it can be to a business when nobody is there in a leadership capacity.
Mm. And I guess as we start to unpack leadership and its role within our industry specifically, because obviously it's such a massive topic, but when you identify that, as you started doing your consultancy work, you noticed that there wasn't strong leadership in a lot of the cases. What problems would you typically see emerge when you've identified that void, I guess, in leadership in those contexts?
I think you tend to see the practice that just isn't growing. That's probably the biggest one. So, and I know there's crossover in these terms, but the term that probably gets used more often is management, staff management.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
There's some crossover on leadership too, but I tend to think of management more as managing the day to day, where leadership is kind of looking out into the future and saying, where do I want to get to? And if there's not a leader, then you really don't have anybody casting that vision and clarifying it for the others. And things are just flat. So I would see over and over practices saying, why aren't we growing? And I would start to look. One of the first questions I would ask Michael is, what are your goals? And you would tend to just hear crickets. So the inability to have a vision and communicate that to others and get people on the same page strategically became a big obstacle. And so I would say just the lack of growth would cause me to question if leadership was in place, and if it was, how effective was it?
And I guess, distinguishing there between leadership and management, can you speak to that a little bit more? I mean, obviously you've mentioned leadership is a bit more broader in scope, and, looks at that longer term perhaps, whereas management is on that day to day. How can one address that crossover? And because I guess anyone can be a leader, to be fair, depending on your initiative, but the management may not be something that you're always partaking in, depending on the role of the practice. I guess, how have you seen that connection be made successfully so that a store is getting the most out of, its leadership or its management team?
Yeah. And I might even flip that around in theory. I think a lot of people can manage. You put them in that position and say, here's what needs to be done today. We need to do payroll, and we need to do this task, and we need to do that task. We need to pay this bill, right? Just managing the day to day. And in a lot of practices, that's what an office manager might do. Where I would look at leadership from the standpoint of, where are you trying to take people? Where are you trying to take the practice? That's why I ask the question a lot of times on early calls with our members is, what are your goals? Where are you trying to get to? And that's not something everyone is necessarily wired to do. But it's really important, especially in an era where change is happening so quickly. So it's not just a matter of, well, I have a 5-year plan and here's what I'm going to do to get there.
Yeah.
That's very important. But the other side of it is being able to anticipate changes that might be competitive or might be something that's threatening to your business. Do you have a plan in place to lead your team around these challenges? So that's a big component of it as well.
From what I understand in the US, it is more often the case that it's an optometry or a doctor-owned practice. In Australia, there's a little bit of a variance where you don't necessarily you don't have to be in optics at all to own an optometry practice. You can employ an optometrist and a dispenser or an optical technician from that point of view and then run a business. So for us, there is, I guess, there's a big highlight on the practice manager or a dispenser being an owner, really being business focused. But from your experience, knowing that there is a high contingent of optometry-owned practices or optometrist-owned practices, do you notice that they focus more on the exam side as opposed to overlooking that management/leadership side? And can you speak to how, I guess, a successful optometrist or optometry owner can help be mindful of that and, I guess, get something out of it?
Well, there's definitely a hyper focus on the clinical side, and a lot of times it's at the detriment of the business side.
Okay.
It's just how it is. And I think for a lot of doctors, we're just not taught this in school. Usually your undergrad is something science-based, right? Biology, chemistry, something pre-med, science-based. And then you go to optometry school. You might get a little bit of practice management education, but it's pretty minimal. So I just think a lot of people that take on that role of practice owner aren't prepared for all the work and all the challenges that are going to come their way as being a practice owner. So that's what we do is we try to help them through that. And we can get into this as well, but it's not just about them. At some point, you have to transition leadership to somebody else, but you have to be able to train them as well. So a lot of our work in that leadership area is not just trying to coach doctors who own the practice on some leadership skills, but also how do those skills transfer to somebody else so you can delegate that to what's usually an office manager in our practices.
And if we could, I'd love to explore that a little bit more, because generally with private practice or with independent practice, who we often work with, well, we always work with, and I'm sure that's the case with yourself as well, they are small teams, and they can vary between sort of 3 to 10. Some of the larger teams might be more, but they're invariably small teams. And the owners and the leaders generally have to wear multiple hats. We mentioned payroll and HR. And at what stage should an owner of a practice start considering delegating leadership responsibilities or management responsibilities from that point of view? Maybe more the management responsibilities to enable them perhaps to focus on other things.
Yeah, we find that if you're going to pin me down to a certain stage of growth from a revenue standpoint, it's going to vary a little bit, but in our experience, when you get to about 700,000-800,000, you need help. And because for one thing, you're getting pulled more into the exam room, so you're just not around as much. When you're a cold start, when you're a new practice, you do wear multiple hats, and you are typically managing. Right, you're also the accountant and the plumber and every other task that goes along with that. But at some point, you get busier. You're getting pulled more on the clinical side, which is fine. It's what you went to school for. And now all of a sudden, as you get bigger, you've got more patients to see, but you've also got more staff, and that's where it gets complicated. Now it's not just you and one other person, or you and 3 other people. It's you and 6 other people, 7 other people, 8 other people. And even though that's still small business, it starts to get more complex, the more personalities and the more people you bring into it with various roles. And what am I doing? And is that person trained? And how do we onboard people? So that's usually the point where we start saying, you need some help. Usually they're telling us, I'm a little overwhelmed here. I need some help. You sure do. Let's talk about getting an office manager and delegating some of the management.
Yeah. And I guess, for me, my mind goes into a million directions at this point, because like you've alluded to, it can really expand out cold start. Is it a well-established practice, and what are the stages at, and there are so many variants that take you down a path that you want to get advice on or support on, or I want to ask questions on in this instance. But ultimately, if we focus on, it working quite well for the point of the conversation, and we're hitting that, say, $700,000 to $800,000 a mark in revenue, And we need to start looking at identifying, where that, I guess, for lack of a better term, that mid-management, is starting to come into play. When that happens, what's the best way to identify, those types of managers, and what sort of traits should owners be looking for? Again, it could be a simple question, but in your experience, where have you seen it roll out successfully, and how have you seen it roll out successfully when they're developing that mid-management level?
Yeah. So I like to look internally first. You have the person internally because you already know them. They understand the culture, they know the people. And it's maybe 50-50 when doctors will say, well, I might have somebody that we could mentor into that role or somebody who would be a great fit. And sometimes it just immediately, no, I don't have that person that I trust in that role. So you have to bring in somebody from the outside. I'll tell you the qualities that I suggest people usually look for because they're the qualities I see in the best managers I've worked with. I'll tell you, first of all, you've really got to care. And, and you've got to care. And the managers, I know who they are. They're the ones who grab me at our own conferences and say, hey, I've got an idea. I want to run it by you. Or I wish my doctor would listen to this. I want to make an impact, right? They're just wired up that way. To be a good manager, almost every single time I've seen a really effective manager, they just genuinely care about the practice, right? I'll give you two qualities that I really like in managers. If you can find the mix, a healthy mix of these two, you'll probably have somebody who's pretty successful in that role. It's a healthy mix of assertiveness and humility. You've got to have some level of assertiveness in that role. Otherwise, you'll just get walked over, right? You have to have the ability to give people candid feedback, to hold people accountable, to earn people's, trust and respect. But it's got to be balanced with some humility, a recognition that you don't have all the answers and you need your team. You're hiring people because maybe they have skills that you don't, and a willingness to listen to them and a willingness to take their ideas and their feedback. And too much of one of those might not end well for you. But when I see those two qualities, I tend to think that that's somebody that if I was hiring, I would consider for a role that involved managing or leading people.
And when you see these people, or if a manager or a leader in an organization is trying to identify these people, are there particular ways of establishing? Is it just a matter of gut instinct, or are there any sort of known processes or perhaps questions or formulas or frameworks, I guess, that will enable one to identify? Or is it purely, in this instance, just gut instinct? I kind of see it. I see it. They've got a bit of assertiveness. That in this instance, now that we know that, they've got a bit of humility. So I think because they're ticking both those boxes, it's progressive to the next sort of stage.
Yeah, well, it's no perfect science. I don't know of any industry that doesn't have some regret over somebody they hired in a management or leadership capacity. So you get burned at this. So I guess if we're talking about two different types of people here, one would be somebody who already works in the practice, which fortunately you've had a chance to get to know them, learn from them. And just keep in mind, I always tell doctors, if you're not sure, you don't necessarily have to give them the title of manager when they come in on Monday. You could mentor somebody into that role. You could give them some additional responsibilities. And Michael, I would say first, ask them if they even want that responsibility. Not everybody wants to be in a leadership role. Not everybody wants to be the boss. So you could see how they do with some added responsibilities, and then let them know, I really like some of the qualities that you have. I'm considering you in a management role. What do you think about that? And would you be willing to take on some additional responsibilities just to see how it goes? If you're bringing in somebody from the outside, that's a whole different conversation. But it really comes down to interviewing and asking the right questions and getting them, just being a good interviewer and asking the questions that get them to tell you what kind of leadership style they have. It gets into the whole behavioral based interviewing. And again, our recommendation for bringing on somebody from the outside is this: don't let them make any major changes in the practice for the first 60 days, which sounds really counterintuitive to what both the employer is going to expect and what the manager thinks is expected of them. Because you're bringing this person from the outside, paying them at a high level because they are a manager, and they're going to feel like I need to come in and make some changes right away and shake things up. But 9 times out of 10, what's going to happen? You're going to irritate the staff. They're not going to like somebody coming in from the outside shaking things up. So we always tell people, give it 60 days, at least 30, but we always say 60, and just learn, get to know the other people in the practice. What are their strengths? What are they good at? Get to know the practice, how things are done, and then start collaborating as a team to talk about how things could improve.
Yeah. I might put you on the spot here if that's okay, and ask, when you're in that interview setting, what's one question that you would ask to try and ascertain, I guess, a quality that you think is really important, whether it's leadership, whether it's, being assertive, whether it is the humility? Is there like a go-to question, or is there, something that, I guess you would want to ask in that situation to sort of get that conversation flowing, to open them up about potentially identifying whether this is, something that they can or can't do?
Yeah, I don't know if it's one particular question, but it goes back to, I think, first identifying what kind of qualities you're looking for, and then asking questions that help you identify if they actually have those qualities. Let me give you an actual real life example of something I overheard sitting in Starbucks once. And I'll give you the quick abbreviated version, but the person who was interviewing the candidate asked a beautiful, what they call behavioral based question. They said, tell me about a time at your last job where you had to deal with an angry customer, right? So behavioral based is getting that person to talk about something in the past and how they handled it. It's not hypothetical. It's how did you handle the situation? Tell me that story. And then you identifying if they actually have the quality you need. So let's assume humility as what you just mentioned. Maybe that was the quality they're looking for. Well, this job candidate said, I just can't believe how difficult people can be and how much of a pain in the neck they can be. And I thought, wow, you're not getting this job.
Yeah.
But it eliminates the problem of bringing somebody on who's not going to have the qualities that you need. Because if you're looking for humility, right, what would you want to typically hear? Well, if somebody came in, I would want to hear what they had to say and understand their side of things, and then try to figure out how can we resolve this situation for the other person. That candidate took a defensive approach, which is just the opposite. It's just what you don't want. So figure out what qualities you're looking for and ask questions that were in previous roles that would help you identify if they have the qualities that you're looking for.
Yeah, I think in that instance, it's almost that empathetic response that you kind of...
Empathy is the word I was looking for, not humility. Thank you. Yeah, that's you threw me off when you said humility. But empathy would be the exact quality, which I think is really important to have in a management.
Yeah, absolutely. And it does point to a level of self-awareness, if that can happen for yourself and also for other people too. And I think in that instance, if you're looking for that, I think that's an awesome quality, or a really important quality too, when it comes to identifying, I guess, traits. And so, I think, and getting to speak, I always find about instances that have perhaps occurred, as opposed to, what would you do if? It's like, well, what did you do when? Can you give me a time when? And it's almost like that you're casting them to reflect on something and what they've taken out of it. So again, obviously there's no exact science when it comes to that recruitment sort of stage of business, and there is luck of the draw. But I did really like the point about not having anyone, especially if they're coming in a position of, I guess, of authority potentially, to do anything in the first 60 days, because that's totally counterproductive. And you're like, well, how do you handle that? And I guess as a question, like, what would you be getting them to do in the first 60 days if you've had to recruit a leader, a practice manager, or an assistant manager, or someone that's going to actually be delegating tasks? What would you do for the first 60 days with them?
Well, and I didn't mean to infer. I'm glad you asked that, because I didn't mean to infer they would just be standing around for 60 days. But I think there's a lot of, typically with the management role, a lot of administrative tasks. Mm-hmm. I like to say office managers in optometry practices often wear two hats, probably wear more, but the two I'm referring to is there tends to be an administrative side and then a people management side. So of course there's going to be the administrative side that they're going to take on those tasks. And I definitely want their feedback and their input on things they're seeing in terms of talking with the staff, our systems, our operations. What do you like? What do you not like? What are you learning from the staff? I'm just suggesting that they don't kick the door open on day one and say there's a new sheriff, because you're going to get a lot of pushback. So I still want to be meeting with them, finding out how it's going. What are your ideas? I would just caution making any significant changes in the beginning until you sort of earn the trust and the respect of your team. And I think if you come in with an attitude of listening, that your team will start to embrace you, and you'll get their buy-in, which is something you really need.
Yeah, 100%. I think from the outset, that's a really critical point. If you're looking, let's say, at the other sort of side of the equation there, with someone that works in the practice already, what are some ways to instill, or especially, because I think from what I hear in a lot of the conversations I have with people on these types of topics is, effectively, it comes down to strategy. It comes down to being strategic in your moves and planning what you're doing and thinking about what you're doing, and don't just let it happen. And the more strategic you can be, hopefully the better the outcome is. So let's say, you're identifying and you're being proactive and you've listened to this podcast and you know that maybe you're turning over sort of, 600 now and you're going to be that 700 to 800 mark, and you want to be strategic in how you act. And you've got some staff already, obviously. Are there ways that you can instill ownership and initiative in the staff so they perhaps can step up? Because I like you, think that the best method of promotion is internally first. So, if we're speaking to someone in that environment, what sort of things can we impart to them with regards to some advice on how they can start to identify if that person is the right person, and if they're not, maybe ways of trying to get them there?
So, I always tell doctors to pay attention to that person in the staff meetings that seems to have a lot of ideas and isn't afraid to raise their hand and come forward with suggestions and ideas for improving the practice. And you're right, maybe in the $600,000 stage, let's just say, maybe you don't need an official office manager yet. You're just not busy enough yet that you need to delegate that part of it. But you are the leader at that point. And the same thing that I would suggest delegating to somebody else, instilling somebody else, is giving ownership to other people. You use the word ownership, and I'm a pretty big fan of that, because the alternative is micromanagement, right? I'm just going to tell everyone what to do. And you can do that, but I just don't think you'll ever get people's, full motivation when you're doing that, because then they're just showing up, they're doing the tasks that are there. And you're never really going to hear their ideas or their input, because they just figure, well, I'm just here to do a job, and nobody really cares about my input either. The alternative to that is actually putting the outcomes that you'd like. Again, if you are a leader and you have goals, you have a vision, is asking the team, what are your ideas? And just that question alone can be really powerful. You tend to see the potential leaders stand up in those situations. They're the ones that raise their hand, and not everybody will raise their hand in that moment, and that's okay. Some people prefer an environment where they have that structure, and they like, I don't want to say being told what to do, but they're just not comfortable in that leadership capacity. But I in generally, from a leadership and management standpoint, would ask your staff regularly, what are your guys' ideas? Here's what we want to do, or here's the problem. Let me hear your ideas. And once you have your team, you give them some ownership over how things are done, then I think through that, you'll get a lot more motivation out of people, because it's all of a sudden it's their ideas. We all like to see our own ideas succeed, and we tend to push back a little bit when other people are forcing their ideas on us. That's just human nature.
Yeah. I think it's one of those secrets to buy-in. I think if you want people to buy in, you have to at least make them feel part of the decision-making process at the very least. If it's not their idea, maybe it's got a sprinkle of their idea in it. And obviously, the more you can sprinkle in it, the more they, again, I guess, go back to that word ownership, feel a part of it. And then obviously they're going to hopefully drive that through too. So I totally could understand why that would work. In your book, and if we focus on leadership here, so I guess more on the individual that's in this position, thinking about this and planning for this, whether it's coming via management or whether it's, just in the concept of leadership. Because I think for our purposes in this context of conversation, they're almost interchangeable. They are different, but I think from our point of view, we're focusing on the similarities of them. You speak about 5 pillars in your book. Can you walk us through the 5 pillars of leadership?
Yeah. So in the book, I identified these 5 pillars based on the feedback that I get. And I make the claim in the book that 90% of the staff management problems that I hear trace back to one or more of these 5 areas. And if you can just focus on these 5 areas, I think you'll improve yourself tremendously. You're right, there's some crossover on these 2 areas, whether we're talking about improving as a manager or as a leader. And I just real quickly to run through them. One, which I think it always starts with clarity, providing clear expectations for people. If your staff does not know what's expected of them, if they don't know what the goals are, if they don't know what their job responsibilities are, and what kind of outcomes are expected of them, then that's a failure of management. So are they clear? And that's usually more than one conversation. So a lot of conversations, a lot of communication in terms of clarifying the goals and the objectives and their responsibilities in all of that. We could look at development, constantly developing your team. And I think we all recognize when we walk into a business and there's a strong effort or emphasis put on developing the people on the team versus when it's not. It becomes really obvious. So which practice is yours? The one that spends a lot of time with that, or the ones that don't? Just to run through the 5, number 3 is leveraging people's strengths. Do you have people in the right role? You might have a really good employee who's just not good at sales. but would be great at billing. A lot of attention to detail, very smart. Are they in the right role? Accountability was the fourth one, which is, by the way, one of the most dodged. I think it was a Harvard study. They found that 50% of people in leadership or management roles identify themselves as terrible at holding
Yeah.
people accountable. So that goes back to
Yeah.
the assertiveness side of things. You have to have that backbone. And lastly, just what I would say is autonomy, which is what we were just talking about, right? The ability to give people ownership over their role. Once you've done the other things, you can't do that on day one. But when you train them, when you've given them clear expectations, you put them in a role they're going to be strong at, is the ability to back away and trust your team and give them some autonomy in how they do their job.
Yeah, I think these are spot on. And I think if people can resonate with these, whether they're the owner of the practice or already in leadership in their business organization, in any capacity, that they're really important traits. And I think the more of this that's happening, the better that the practice will run. The accountability one, I nodded my head the whole way through that, because, I think it's one of the most challenging, especially in the context of the stores that we work with, where they are small practices. So if you have to hold somebody accountable, it gets hard to do, because potentially, if you upset the boat, or if you, create tension there and you're very dependent on that particular person, it might change the narrative of your conversation potentially. And then, just to appease everyone so you don't cause a conflict, I guess you might want to perhaps let it slide, I guess, for lack of a better term. And I guess in that situation, and if we focus on accountability as the one point, how can someone in a management position or in a leadership position within the store help or hold people more accountable without necessarily upsetting them?
Yeah, so you're exactly right. And I think that's why people fear it. People generally avoid confrontation. So I would say it doesn't have to be confrontational, holding people accountable. So first of all, giving people clear expectations on what their role is and giving them some autonomy and a lot of communication. My favorite definition of accountability is putting people in a position in which they know in advance they're going to be held accountable for their actions at a later time. So if you and I sat down and let's say I was your boss in this scenario, right? I said, Michael, let's talk about our goals for Q4, which is what we're in right now. Okay, great. You and I have a conversation. We align. What are your ideas, Michael? Let's talk. Okay, I think this will work. What do you think? We come together on all of this, and then we put a date on the calendar that we're going to circle back. And at that point, I'm going to pull a word from the corporate world here. I'm going to ask you to report on this. How are things going? And you're going to look at me. I am not necessarily, and if I'm uncomfortable with confrontation, I just took confrontation out of it. We're going to set a date on the calendar. We're going to come back and you're going to give me a report on how things are going. If things aren't going as planned, I'm going to ask you, what is the problem? Maybe there's a valid reason for it and maybe there's not, but we're going to have that conversation. And I think once your team understands that when something is agreed upon, that there's going to be a follow-up, that you're going to be in a position where you got to look your boss in the eye and report and account for your performance. That right there establishes accountability without you waiting for things to fail and then having to pull your team member into your office for some uncomfortable, awkward conversation.
Yeah, I think framing it basically so that, the next steps are known. And I guess not knowing what the conversations will be in those next steps, but knowing that there will be next steps, I think helps manage that. And that makes total sense. And I think there is also an aspect of not being afraid of it. I think that comes from knowing how to handle it, I think. And like you've just put in that fashion, I mean, the communication of it is just so critical. And I guess communication throughout all aspects of those foundational concepts of leadership that you've mentioned, which I think are great, it comes down to communication at every level, and so many things generally do. So I guess if we look at communication as a point, and that was a practical example as to how I guess we can address accountability, but as a general concept, how can a leader and how can people in authority in a practice, improve their communication to ensure that their whole team's aligned? And what tips have you seen work in the past, or some general concepts that ensure that effective communication is occurring in the practice? Is it as simple as having regular meetings? Is it as simple as, making sure that you're making time for individuals? Or what are the things that you've seen that have worked well, and how can one improve, I guess, the communication?
Well, I've never told anyone in 10 years that you're over communicating. So I would say, regular meetings is a big part of it. And I'll mention it. This doesn't always have to be formal hour-long meetings every Tuesday at 10 o'clock. I've had offices say we actually don't have formal weekly meetings or anything like that, but in our office, there's just a lot of communication. I have an open door. We're always talking and communicating with each other. So that is a big component of it. And ironically, the communication side, where people might struggle with that, I'll give them a way to communicate better with doing less work. Ask more questions. Let your staff do more of the talking. Good leaders aren't always just standing there telling people what to do. What they're really good at is finding out what other people are good at. What do they want to do? What are their strengths? What are their challenges? And they're good listeners. So if you're in a leadership or management position and you feel like I don't communicate well, maybe your fear is that I need to be the one who's always doing the talking and always solving all the problems and always directing traffic, so to speak. But sometimes it's a matter of what would make you a better communicator is actually talking less. You referenced sales before, and I agree completely with what you said. And I would say the exact same thing about sales. The top salespeople, what they often find is they do less talking than their counterparts, because they're asking better questions and they're getting the other person to do more talking, and then you connect with people. So it's not complicated. I think some people are just naturally better communicators than others.
Yeah.
If you really want to learn about it, you could go to things like Toastmasters. I don't know if they have those in Australia. You could take leadership courses. You could read books. You can develop that skill, but if that's not your thing, it's better questions. Let other people do more of the talking. And I think that alone will improve communication, ironically, in any organization.
Yeah, I'm led to think, or when you say that, you've got two ears in one mouth, and you should use it in that ratio.
Yeah, so exactly.
It's a little bit like it's a bit like trying to, I guess, enforce that sort of mentality if you can. Again, something that I think about, and I'm not sure if the case over in the US with the experience that you have, but invariably optical managers in the past, and when I say the past, over the last 20 or 30 years, I mean, I'm fortunate, I've grown up in optics my whole life, so I've seen a whole heap of, different types of managers and different types of, leaders. But what I've seen in the past is most optical managers are quite hard in nature. They're almost like, I was talking about this to someone the other day where we were saying, they're almost taskmasters, because our industry is so much based on perfection. I mean, the script has to be correct. The measurements have to be correct. The frame has to fit the face correctly. The right measurements need to be taken. And if you can't necessarily be blasé, you've got to be really, and I feel that because there is that high precision, it does, the people that do manage that are generally, and I'm generalizing here, can be seen as being really finicky and really, really, I guess, attention to detail. And that then sort of, when you then have to try and relax that or be authoritative in nature. So I'm not sure what your take is on that. And if there is a manager like that, how can they, other than obviously getting more training, like, do you feel that that's something that someone should recognize and try and manage that accordingly? Or how have you seen that little dynamic work out? Just based on, because, what we're saying here is a lot of, you need to step back, you need to listen, you need to incorporate other people's ideas. And in small business, it can be hard for a manager to do that. So what tips would you have for somebody, I guess, who's in that, in that situation?
Yeah. So, I mean, there are going to be aspects of any job, and I mean, this would be doctors as well, that's tactical. So, I mean, I can understand why somebody in that position would want to make sure that people are measuring, getting the right PD and measuring. So that's part of training and making sure that they are competent at the tactile side of their job, right? It's no different than a doctor getting the right prescription.
For sure.
But there's the other aspects of it as well, where you could look at problems that would benefit from other people's input too. And you look at, if we're talking about optical side, you could look at workflow through there. You could look at sales or sales. So you could take things like that and go to your team and say, hey, sales dipped this past quarter. Let's hear everyone's ideas. Why is that happening? How could we get better? Hey, Tim over there did really well this quarter. Tim, what are you doing differently? Let's learn from you. That to me is a collaboration that could have a really healthy outcome. That's different than the manager walking in and say, you guys are failing. You need to do better. Get it together. Right?
Yeah.
That's going to be a disaster.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I speak to. And I think that as more information on leadership as a concept, it's now being infused into our industry. And I say that, it's our industry probably isn't, we've identified the fact that most optoms and clinicians are not, trained in that business leadership side of things. But as we're developing and, we're growing as an industry, we're noticing more and more of that. It's obviously why, you do what you do. And obviously, there are, I guess, mechanisms in Australia here too, where you're getting that advice and making that knowledge mindful. And then all of a sudden you can start to resonate that in your practice and try and change that up. So it's, I guess, the whole point of the conversation. One of the big issues that you see, I'm sure, I'm making an assumption here, is staff-related issues. And we have spoken about it from a few different angles. Why do you think overall staffing is generally the number one issue for businesses?
Well, you're dealing with, it's even more complicated now because it feels like, I think for most practices, I'm going to assume things aren't a whole lot different in Australia, but since COVID, turnover has become a real problem. Retention, the marketplace has changed a lot, and it's harder to hang on to people. But even prior to that, you're dealing with different personalities. You're dealing with different people that have different strengths, different personalities, and it's easier to contain when it's two people. But when it becomes 3, 4, 5, 6, now you've all of a sudden got different personalities. You've got people that don't get along together as well, people that don't play nice together, and finding people that want. And so some of these positions are not the highest paid positions. So finding people willing to come in and give you a strong effort for a job that may not pay as a real high wage, it's a struggle. It's probably the biggest struggle that I hear from offices, and it's such a struggle that I've heard more on numerous times recently that some doctors are second guessing. They're saying, well, I was going to retire in 3 years, but dealing with people right now is something that's forcing me to consider, should I get out sooner? Which is, it's sad. It's one of the reasons I like teaching and coaching on this, because I want to take that away from them. I want to show them a way that it doesn't have to be that bad. It could be, it's always going to be challenging, but if you learn a few basic skills, it might not be.
Yeah. And I think post-COVID, obviously, a lot of businesses that we speak to, obviously, will always talk about, pre-COVID, post-COVID. So it's very much a line in the sand with regards to things and how things have evolved since then. I guess what would be your advice, or what would be some tips that you'd provide to a practice owner or a leader within a practice with regards to how best ensuring that they can reduce that turnover? I mean, is it as simple as effective communication? Is it remuneration? Like, when you see these practices where they've got low turnovers, what are they doing right?
Well, I'm not going to dismiss the pay, because we're all in
an important part.
Yeah, it's important. So, are you paying people at a competitive level? And then beyond that, are you providing a workplace that people want to keep coming back to? People don't just quit jobs. Sometimes you get a significantly better, offer somewhere else, and sometimes people will leave for that reason. But what are they unhappy about? And there's the phrase, people don't leave jobs, they leave bosses, or they leave managers. On this very topic that we're talking about, there is a lot of truth to that. So another reason I like working with managers is, if you improve your ability to manage other people, I think your retention will work as well. Because when you've got a boss, a manager, a supervisor that you like working for, and a lot of that does come down to the basics. Man, there's nothing unique about management. It's just, are you a good person? Do you care about the people on your team? Are you supporting them? Do you listen to them? Do you have empathy for them? They're going to like coming to work more than if it was just the opposite.
It's almost like you've got to be invested in them, so they're invested in you.
Completely. Yeah. And it works that way. Yeah, completely. Nobody's going to run through a wall for a boss they don't like. They'll show up. And if you're not a good boss, people will do just enough to not get fired. So that's what you've got. That's what you've got. Yeah. And then you wonder why things aren't working out well with the team you've got. But that's what you're going to end up with is a room full of people doing just enough to not get fired.
To not get fired, yeah. That's a good way to put it. An approach that obviously you take, and I resonate with it, and I try and do the same, is when there are problems being presented, the team gets involvement. And we've spoken about the ownership and the buy-in and ensuring that it gets seen through. How do you balance that concept of empowering the staff to be part of the solution and also ensuring that they work? Because I'm sure there'll be times when, and perhaps this is more about the time when maybe you can't sprinkle their idea in, or you can't incorporate it because there's just too much deviation from what you're trying to do. When you're in that particular situation, how do you suggest, that's handled, and what can a manager do if they're faced, with a scenario like that?
I'm glad you asked that. I think it needs to be clear to the team too, that not everybody can always get their way. But this is something in most large organizations, this is how it works, right? We sit in meetings, even the company that I work with, we sit in meetings and we listen to everyone's ideas. But at the end of the day, this is something leaders have to do, is make ultimate decisions. But they're going to make much better decisions when you have the input of everybody on their team. And if the team believes that you're taking their input seriously, sometimes they might get their idea go through and sometimes they won't. But it's not about always having your idea go through. It's about feeling heard. So I think when you take that all into consideration, and then at the end of the day, when you make a decision, tell them why. You tell them why we decided to go in this direction. Why does that give us a better opportunity to achieve our goal or solve the problem? And I think they'll get it. But it's more of a culture and an environment where you always listen to people's ideas. But yeah, at the end of the day, not everybody can have their way. No. That's not possible.
Yeah, I guess it's being realistic about it too. So as we wrap up today, I've really enjoyed the conversation. I mean, we've spoken about so many things that are, I think, quite broad in nature and can be listened to and adopted in a couple of different areas, whether it's in meetings or whether it's just general communication or whether it's looking at improving yourself as a leader and the tie-in that it has with the success of a practice, and I do like these conversations because someone can listen to this and really, again, take it in so many directions. But, if we've got a practice owner that's listening today and they want to be a better leader tomorrow, what would your advice be to them to be the first step that they should take to become a better leader?
Honestly, Michael, read more books. Okay. I'm serious. Read more books, listen to more podcasts. There is really no, I don't want to sound this the wrong way, but almost no excuse for not improving that skill if you wanted to, because there's just so many resources out there. There's like 1 million+ books on leadership, but just keep learning. Keep learning, keep listening to podcasts, read books, talk to other people, and keep refining the skills. And then try different things. And here's what I would tell you. Whether you agree with some things I said or disagree, it doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, the only thing that really matters is the outcomes you're getting. And if you're not happy with your outcomes, try something different. We're only rewarded in life on our outcomes, not our ability to control other people. It's our ability to get the most out of others. What kind of outcomes are you getting? And if you're not happy with the outcomes that you're getting in terms of owning a practice, in terms of the team that you're leading, then try something different. Learn new skills, learn new ways of understanding, leading people, and just try it and see if the results improve.
Yeah, I think that curiosity for knowledge in spaces like this are critical. And the form of education, there are a plethora of methods that you can take up, whether it's podcasts, books, audio books. You don't even have to read them. You can listen to books as well. So I think, if you've got that curiosity, and the people that do listen to this podcast invariably do. So speaking to them directly, we know that you do. So, use this episode as a catalyst to get out there and to investigate and ask questions. And on that note, I mean, you've obviously got a few books on the matter too. So how can listeners find your book and I guess your podcast too, if they want to hear a little bit more about some of the things you speak about?
Yeah, so you could go to my website for the books. There's links there. It's Dr. Steve Vargo, V as in Victor, ARGO.com. And then the podcast is I Own a Business, EYE Own a Business. You see what I did there? And then you could, that's on most of the major platforms.
Yeah, we'll share those links as well. So if the audience do want to listen a little bit more or read a bit more about what your work, they can do that. But Steve, thank you so much for your time. I know it's the end of the day for you over there, so I've held you back a little bit on wrapping up your day. So I really appreciate your time and your insights. It's been a really awesome conversation. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. This has been great. I appreciate you having me on.
Thanks for listening to The Focused View. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a 5-star review, subscribe on your preferred podcast app, and share it with your colleagues. It helps us reach more eye care professionals across Australia. For additional resources and downloads, visit thefocusedview.com.au. I'm Michael Nasser. Until next time, keep focused.